Good evening, brethren. I hope I'm not going to eat into Brother Chris' time. Have you ever maybe thought of doing something of significance, something great, something that you'll be remembered by? You know, I was reading in the book of Matthew chapter 26, and from verse 6 it reads as follows. Please read with me Matthew 26, verse 6. Now when Jesus was at Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came up to him with an alabaster flask of expensive ointment, and she put it on his head, and he reclined at the table. And when the disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, "Why this waste? For this could have been sold for a large sum and given to the poor." But Jesus, aware of this, said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? For she has done a beautiful thing to me. For you will always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. In pouring this ointment on the body, she has done it to prepare me for burial. Truly I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed in the world, Truly I say to you, whenever this gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." This woman is doing something of significance. This is something that the disciples, they've never thought about. So she just take this expensive perfume and she put on Jesus Christ and she wiped it. In other accounts, they say she wiped it with her own hair. And Jesus Christ says what she has done is of great significance, and she will be remembered throughout the history. Whenever the gospel is preached, this woman will be remembered as well. There are two important things that I just want to quickly run with. The first thing is that your action might overshadow your name. You know, when you read from verse 6, some actions that we do, they might overshadow our names. If you read in verse 6, we are told that these people came into the house of Simon the leper. Simon is identified as the leper. What are we identified as people, as Christians? Are we identified as Christians, or maybe do we have another identity? Are we known as Christians, or are we known as Tabo the what? If you read in the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 7 verse 1, it says, "A good name is better than a fine perfume." So it's very important to preserve our name that we have been given by God. The name of Christians is the name that we are given by God. Someone wrote in the Facebook this week, he said, "God knows us by his name." He says he knows our sins, but he called us by his name. And Satan knows our name, but he called us by our sins. So God, in his power, in his might, in his mercy, in his kindness, he calls us by his name, but Satan calls us by his sins. So as Christians, we need to preserve our name and ensure that this name that we are called by is preserved. And the other thing that I want to quickly say is that you will not please people all the time. We see that this woman did not please the disciples as she was doing this act. And the disciples started complaining and said this could have been sold for a large sum of money, and the proceeds would have been given to the poor. But Jesus Christ says, no, you'll always have the poor among you. So instead of complaining about what this woman has done for me, you should actually praise her. And one of the things, what's happening with us in life is that there will always be people that complain about us, but it's important to look at the price. Don't get whipped away by the complaints or things that people say. One of the important things that these disciples say as they were criticizing her is that they say this is waste. Let me tell you this evening, that whatever you do for the Lord is not a waste. Coming here this time to learn from the word of God is not a waste. Whatever you do in your time, glorifying God, praising God, and any other work that you do for the church is not a waste. If you pass by Bram and pick up 2-3 people, it's never a waste, but it's something of great significance. So this disciple says, this is a waste. You could have sold this. You know, sometimes you think of the resources that we have and you think that they could be wasted in the church. It's never wasted in the church, but instead they are used to raise the church or to help the church in any way that the help is needed. And one of the important things that I also wanted to mention this evening is how big can we go as Christians? How big can we go? This woman went as far as anointing Jesus Christ. You know, if you anoint Jesus, I'm sure maybe in her mind she remembered the scripture in the book of Hosea chapter 1 verse 11, whereby it says, your people will anoint you with oil and make you a king. Maybe she remembered that scripture, because we don't see in the scripture Jesus Christ being anointed unless by this woman in the scripture. And it's very important that we must do the important things for the Lord. How big can we go? Jesus Christ went as far as what is written in the book of Psalms, chapter 103, verse 12, when it says, as far as east is from the west, so far your sins has been removed. So this is as far as God can go. God went as far as removing our sins completely removing our sins. As far as east is far from west, so is how far Jesus Christ has removed our sins. This is as far as God had went in order to buy us back from the world into the kingdom of the light. So as Christians as well, how far can we go for the kingdom of God? How far can we go for the church? How far can we go for one another? How far can we go for the brethren? Let us go as far as we can. And let us remember that whatever mile we can take in the kingdom is not a waste, but it's for the growth of the kingdom. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Tava, and also Brother Dookie, for that. As was mentioned, Brother Justice is down with the flu, so I've got chapter 11. I seem to get the heavy chapters. It's not arranged that way, it just happens like that. A very, very interesting chapter. So we can all turn there to Daniel chapter 11. We'll continue. We're heading towards the end of our study. If you look at the book of Daniel, it's a book of different parts, not just from a language standpoint, because you know the first, from chapter 2 to chapter 7, is written in Aramaic rather than the usual language of the Old Testament Hebrew. But also that the first 7 chapters are very much, or mostly, events that occurred, what we call narrative. A lot of it is just what happened to Daniel and what happened to Daniel's friends and what happened to some of the kings like Nebuchadnezzar. And so there's a lot of what God does to demonstrate his power with his people in captivity, with his righteous servants like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's the first 7 chapters that give that very powerful demonstration of how God operates, even when it looks like his people are dominated by another, because he's done this deliberately. And so even great Nebuchadnezzar had to come to that realization that this was a God greater than any other God. So that's the first 7 chapters, and then pretty much from chapter 8 through 10, and also chapter 12, what you have is prophecy as what very much figurative prophecy that is very descriptive, highly descriptive. We do have a little bit of it in the first chapters. You know, for example, the statue of Daniel is very much like that. So that's very much part of the book as a whole. And of course, the writing on the wall is another one that comes in the first chapters. And so Daniel is divided up into different parts. And chapter 11 represents a part of Daniel that is quite different from the rest as well. It is represented, it's not so much figurative, although it is that as well, but it's almost like it's a history written without names. A history written without names, but just referring them by, you could say, in a sense. In other words, it doesn't talk about what particular king is ruling, but it will refer to the king of the north and the king of the south. So, not like Game of Thrones or anything like that, but so, well, maybe a little bit like that, and you wonder if whoever wrote that read Daniel as well, because you've got basically the king of the north and the king of the south, and for most of the chapter you're dealing with the king of the north and the king of the south. And essentially what it is the history that occurs in that period of time after the Bible closes. In other words, after Malachi, right up to a time close to the 1st century, but not up to that particular point in time. So it's that period of time which there is no actual prophet of God operating. That's that silent period as far as the prophets are concerned. And what is the situation then? Well, primarily what the situation is you've got Alexander comes onto the scene, and he defeats Persia. And if you look at the previous chapter, chapter 10 and verse 20, it says, then he said, do you understand why I came to you? But I shall now return to fight against the prince of Persia. So I'm going forth, and behold, the prince of Greece is about to come. Of course, this is a little bit later from a time perspective, from a human time perspective, because it's in Daniel's time, and essentially about 350 BC is when Alexander comes onto the scene, and to about 330, 40, so not quite 350 BC. He dies about 330 BC. And in that time, he conquers Persia. So this is a reference to that. The coming of the Prince of Greece, that's Alexander the Great. And chapter 11 deals with what happens after Persia has been conquered, and after the death it includes the death of this mighty empire that Alexander the Great created. And he dies very young. He's in his early 30s when he dies. And his 2 sons are quickly dispatched to the same realm as he's gone to. In other words, they're killed. And this great empire is now divided up amongst his generals. And there's a little bit of fighting. And 4 of them end up with a piece of that great empire. Asia Minor is one of them, what we call Turkey today. And then Macedonia going to Greece is another one. But we're not concerned with those ones. But there are 2 that we are concerned with, 2 divisions of that divided empire. And one of them is ruled from Egypt by people we know as the Ptolemies. And the other one that's the king of the south, by the way. King of the south is a reference to Egypt. And the king of the ruled by the Ptolemies. The king of the north is basically Syria, ruled from Syria. Anybody know where Syria is in relation to Judea? Anybody know where Syria is in relation to Judea? Hasn't changed, still like that today. It's like that then, it's like that still today. We're all aware today Syria's got a civil war that's been going on for a long time. And so in relation to Judea, or Israel as it's called today, it's just it's to the north. Okay? So north of Judea, and of course Egypt is to the south. So king of the north, Syria, and king of the south, Egypt. Okay? The king of the north is ruled by the Seleucids initially. King of the south is ruled by the Ptolemies. This is a very detail-rich chapter, and I'm going to try. I'm giving you an overview, okay, so that I can try and move quickly through it, and without going into too much detail, because we could take weeks going through all of this detail. And then at the end of it, you'd sit there and say, what? You know, I don't remember any of this. Because that would be a fair thing. It's a very detail-rich, and you might ask the question, yeah, from our standpoint, we look at it's like history. From the standpoint of Daniel writing, it's some detailed information about what is about to come over the next few hundred years. From our standpoint, it's just history. You know? We can connect the dots. We can connect the king of the north and the king of the south and the various kings of the north and the kings of the south with the history. But yeah, to some extent it is like the Game of Thrones, because you've got all this intrigue, you're always trying to fight each other and defeat each other. You know, sometimes one wins and sometimes the other one wins, and you know, people get killed and they get married and they get divorced and they get murdered, and so it's like that. That's what happens over the next few hundred years. And eventually it has a real impact on Judea. Because one of the most famous one of the most famous kings of the north is called Antiochus Epiphanes, and he comes to Jerusalem, and he's upset because he's been given a bit of a beating twice, going against Egypt, and the Romans get involved, and so the Romans finally come onto the scene. And what he does is he's the one who sacrifices a pig in the temple. And he also puts, on a second occasion, he puts the altar of Zeus on top of the altar of sacrifice. This is the abomination of desolation that Jesus also talks about. The abomination of desolation is when the temple is, is desacralized, is not made unsacred. And where it's made desolate, it's just taken out the stuff of the temple. That's what he does, and it starts what's called the Maccabean revolt. And if anybody ever has a Bible that contains what's called the Apocrypha, which is the books that are not considered inspired in the Old Testament, the Jews, although they're written by people, Hebrew people, they've never been considered to be inspired. They were never considered to be inspired ever by the Jews or Christians all the centuries. The Catholics in the Council of Trent in the 16th century accepted them, but no one else ever has. Not the Jews, nor Christians as a whole. None have accepted these books as inspired, even though they're written by Jewish writers. The Jews themselves didn't consider them to be inspired. But the book of Maccabees is just the history of this period where they actually get independence for a while from Greek rule until the Romans come along and conquer it in 63 BC. So that's quite a bit of history. And look, and I'm aware that I'm talking like this. I'm talking to people in general for whom history is like, just like watching paint dry. Listening to history is like watching paint dry. It's like I could think of something more exciting to do with my time. So I acknowledge that. But every now and again, you've got to just inject yourself into some history, because there's a timeline. You might have heard me say it before, that Daniel operates under a very strict, constrained timeline, where certain events have to happen and will happen, and then the Messiah will come, and then he will establish his kingdom. And it's basically within the time frame of 4 kingdoms, the final one being the Roman kingdom, right? We've gone through this throughout the whole of Daniel, right from the statue itself, right until this point. We've talked about the fact that the statue and the legs of iron and the feet of iron and clay, the 4th kingdom, that has got some fundamental weaknesses to it. Although it's the most ruthless of all the kingdoms, it's got fundamental weaknesses to it. That's it's describing the Roman kingdom. And it's saying in that period of time, a kingdom will be established that will never be destroyed. And we know that's exactly what happened, that when Jesus was resurrected, on the day of Pentecost, when the Spirit came, the kingdom was established. This kingdom that would never end was established. Now, people make the mistake of moving beyond that and saying that the kingdom is still to come. You know, millennials, they say the 1,000-year reign is still to come. But we're part of the kingdom, and we went through some scriptures on all of that. And I'm saying that to avoid getting into too much depth in here, because it's too much depth for us, for our purposes, and even for general Christian purposes, really. All right, so let's go and read some of it. Let's read the first 4 verses of that. So, Brother Tava, have you got that, Tava? Who's got the first 4 verses that they can read? Have you got it? First 4 verses of Daniel chapter 11. You're nice and close to it. Mike. Oh, is it not working?
And as for me, in the first day of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. And now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall rise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. And as soon as he has risen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided towards the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to the other besides this.
All right, so the king that he's talking about, first of all, the king that's mentioned, Darius the Mede, that's of course another name for Cyrus, and he's the one who released the people from captivity to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple and rebuild Jerusalem. And then he's talking about the 4th, the king, after that, and that happens to be Xerxes, who's the same, another name for him is Ahasuerus, and he's mentioned in Esther. He's the king in Esther, and he actually takes a huge army and goes against the Greeks and gets defeated by the Greeks, and after that Persia goes into decline, but he was incredibly wealthy. And then a mighty king will arise. In verse 3 it talks about the realm of Greece, and that mighty king is Alexander the Great. But as soon as he's arisen, in verse 4, his kingdom will be broken and parceled out towards the 4 points of the compass. And that's what we talked about, is that no sooner as he's established this great kingdom, this great empire, then he dies, and it's divided up into 4. So that's the history of that. And we have talked about this before. We talked about it in chapter 7, where it talks about the 4 heads of the leopard, and then in chapter 8 by the 4 horns. But when he dies in 323, of course his 2 sons are killed, and his generals basically divide up the kingdom. And that sets the stage for what follows. Right, so let's read from chapter 5 to chapter 9.
Verse 5. Then the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princesses shall be stronger than he, and shall rule, and his authority shall be great authority. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure, but she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her, and he who supported her in those times.
All right, let's just hold there for a second. So you've got the king of the north and the king of the south, and I'm not going to worry to call them the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, okay? Because it might just cut the connection. But we get what this is doing is a timeline of various kings rising and falling, and actually what they do. And they do, like as most kings do, they try to get an alliance by intermarriage between 2 kingdoms. And so that's what you have happening with regard to this. And in verse 6, it's actually the king there marries, he actually divorces his wife, whose name is Laodice, to marry the daughter of the king of the south, and her name is Bernice. So when the king of the south dies, then the alliance, of course, no longer is valid anymore. Then this king, whose name is Antiochus, he divorces then Bernice, the second wife, and then he takes back Laodice. That was a bad idea, because Laodice, you see, this is like Game of Thrones. Laodice is not happy. So what does she do? She poisons him, and he dies, and he has her sons kill his ex-wife, Bernice, the second wife, and her children. All right, Game of Thrones, that happened. So, of course, this is real, this is what happened. So it didn't work out too well. And then what happened is, with what follows is that a revenge is taken by her brother, who will then come up against him and win, and then kill Laodice and her sons. So and then he goes home and he's happy with regard to that. All right, so that's what happens with all of that, and that's in verse 9 and 10. Actually, with regard to that, did we read verse 9 and 10? Let's just read 10 through 13.
10. Yeah. His sons shall wage war and assemble multitude of great forces, which shall keep coming and overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress. Then the king of the south, moved with rage, shall come out and fight against the king of the north, and he shall rise a great multitude, but he shall be given into his hand. And when the multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. For the king of the north shall again rise. For the king of the north shall again rise, a multitude greater than the first, and after some years he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies.
Okay, so even though he had this big army, he didn't succeed. So you can see the back and forth, right? King of the north, king of the south, king of the north fighting with the king of the south, getting big armies, sometimes winning, sometimes losing. All the political intrigue, all the murder, and so on, and that just keeps on going. But from verse 14, we get one of the more famous ones, and he's called Antiochus the Great. Okay, Antiochus the Great, and he basically is from verse 11 to 19. And he invades Egypt. He's from the north. He invades Egypt, and he also gets in verse 14. He gets some help. We'll read, but you can read it with this in mind. He gets some help by a Jewish faction. They were probably hoping to get some independence as a result of helping him, but he doesn't succeed, and so he keeps on trying to invade. And eventually what happens is he attacks the coastal region, but he's stopped by a Roman army. Now this is the first appearance of the Romans on the scene, because the Romans are rising in power. And he's humiliated by the Romans. And his navy, which he had, as part of the fight, was reduced. He had a big navy, was reduced to 10 ships. So this is the first sign of the fourth kingdom in the Roman Empire. That's mentioned there in verse 14. So we've read up to verse 14. Huh?
We read up to verse 13.
Okay, so read verse 13 and 14.
For the king of the north shall again rise, a multitude greater than the first, and after some years he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies. In those times many shall rise against the king of the south, and the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. Then that's verse 14.
Yeah, I'll get you to read beyond that. Just to mention there, the Jews helping him. In verse 14 it says, the violent ones, talking to Daniel, among your people will also lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision. They're trying to get independence, so they're supporting Antiochus the Great, in this fight back and forth. All right. Let's read to verse 18.
Then the king of the north shall come and throw up siege works and take a well-fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not stand, or even his best troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. But he who comes after him shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land, with destruction in his hand. He shall set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he shall bring terms of an agreement and perform them. He shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but he shall not stand or be to his advantage. Afterwards he shall turn his face to the coastlands and shall capture many of them. But a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. Then he shall turn his face back towards the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall, and shall not be found.
Okay, so you've got this back and forth, and as I'm not going to go into detail. But then from verse 20, let's see how many verses I want to read. I'm deliberately going very, very quickly, but I think you can get an idea of a back and forth here. Huh? King of the north, king of the south. And you can trace every king on both sides and what happened to them. You can match it from history. This is projecting forward from Daniel's time, but you can, which is in the 6th century. But you can project it. You can project. It's projected forward, but we can look back on it and match kings. So you've got Antiochus the Great, and then finally you also get to Antiochus Epiphanes. But first of all, you get one that's mentioned in verse 20. But the main one that has a big impact on Jewish history actually appears in verse 21 through 39. So let's not read all of those verses. Let's first read just from verse 20 to 22. We'll deal with it just piecemeal.
Then shall arise in his place one who shall stand, an exactor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. In his place shall rise a contemptible person to come, royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant.
Alright, so after Antiochus the Great, you get his successor is poisoned. So that's why it talks about it there in verse 20, that within a few days he'll be shattered, though not in anger or battle. He's actually poisoned by Antiochus Epiphanes. I've avoided mentioning most of them, but he's quite important, Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes means the shining one. Okay. It's an indication of deity, so he regarded himself as a god, as ancient rulers often did. So Antiochus Epiphanes was indicating that he was a god. So he poisons the guy before him. So that's why it says that he'll be shattered, but not in anger nor in battle. He's actually just poisoned. And then this despicable creature that poisoned him is Antiochus Epiphanes. And he actually takes over. As I say, in these chapters, he's starting to consolidate his power, and he'll go against Egypt, but he'll also go against Judah. And that's where the real impact is with regard to the Jewish people. All right, so let's take it from verse 24. And let's read to 28.
Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province, and he shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers' fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time.
All right, let me just interrupt there. He'll do what his predecessors didn't do. He managed to conquer Egypt. So that's what he was able to do, but only for a time. Okay, so he goes there, he conquers them, he takes tribute, then he goes back. All right, carry on, verse 25.
And he shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for plots shall be devised against him. Even those who eat his food shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain.
Okay, verse 27 as well.
And as for the two kings, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for the end is yet to be at the time appointed.
Okay. So they both lie to each other, it talks about. But it'll not, there's still things to happen. The end is not yet. Verse 28.
And he shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the Holy Covenant, and he shall work his will and return to his own land.
All right, so he's got designs on Jerusalem, and it talks about set against the Holy Covenant. That's it. The Holy Covenant is a reference to the Jewish people. They're the ones who have God's Holy Covenant. So his heart is set against them, and he's after them. So let's continue on there. And read verses 29 let's just read verse 29 and 30.
At the time appointed he shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdrawn, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the Holy Covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering. And they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate.
The abomination of desolation, okay? So, first of all, in chapter 28, on that particular occasion, what he does on his first trip through Jerusalem is he sacrifices a pig in the temple. Which is a complete abomination. But he's not finished yet. And he decides to have another excursion to attack the south, the king of the south. But as it says, it doesn't turn out the way it did before. Circumstances are different. And it talks about the ships of Kittim. Now, Kittim is a reference to Cyprus, and that's where the Roman ships come. So this is actually talking about the Roman ships. And so the Roman ships come from there, and essentially what happens is the Roman ambassador meets him 3 kilometers from Alexandria, which is of course in Egypt, and he says to him, the Roman Senate wished him to withdraw from Egypt. They're having this meeting with this Roman senator. And Antiochus replied, he'd have to think about it. I'll think about it. Okay. So this Roman ambassador, what he does is he draws a line around him in a circle, and he says, I want your answer before you step over this line. Okay, so you'll think about it. You can think about it and all the time that you're willing to stand here on this side of that line. So he has to give in, he's completely humiliated. So what he actually does is then he returns home, and he goes into Jerusalem, and that's when he puts the altar of Zeus on the altar of sacrifice, which is part of the sanctuary. Just at the entrance to the sanctuary, the altar of sacrifice. So this is the abomination of desolation that is spoken of here. Now what he also does in the next few verses actually talk a little bit about that. And it explains some of the hatred that exists between the Pharisees and the Sadducees in the first century. Because the Sadducees are basically influenced by the Greeks. They're very much on they got a lot of Greek influence, the Sadducees. We know that from the first century. But this is where some of it occurs. This is where some of it occurs. And essentially he co-opts them, he bribes them, the Sadducees. So they go on his side, which of course infuriates the Pharisees and creates a huge rift between them. And ultimately it doesn't turn out well for the Sadducees because the Maccabees are, and Judas Maccabee is the most famous one. They throw the Greeks out of Judea. So even though for a period of time the Sadducees are getting the benefit of the bribes and so on, they get kicked out of Judea by the Maccabean revolt. In the Maccabean revolt, that's the books of Maccabees tells all of that story that is related here. Okay, so that's what happens there, and you can see the description of the language talking about it here. Let's read from verse 32 to 35.
He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. And the wise among the people shall make many understand truth, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame by captivity and plunder. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery, and some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end. For it still awaits the appointed time. And the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished. For what is decreed shall be done.
Okay. So there you can talk at verse 32. Verse 31 is the abomination of desolation, and he does away with the sacrifice. And he will turn to godlessness those who act wickedly towards the covenant. Those are the Sadducees, who act wickedly towards the covenant. But the people who know God will display strength and take action. So they go to war against them and actually succeed. And that many of them, of course, will fall by the sword for a period of time. And now they will be granted a little help, and many will join with them in the hypocrisy, talking about the Sadducees. Some who have insight will fall in order to refine, purge, and make them pure until the end time. Now, the end time doesn't refer to the end of the world, but it refers to the end of the Jewish system and the beginning of the kingdom. That's the way it's used in Daniel. The end time is not the end of the world, but the end of the Jewish kingdom. And so this is God's final purge of the Jewish people to prepare them for the Messiah. So that's what that's all about. All right, so just by summary, the king of the north against the king of the south, and they're fighting back and forth generation after generation. And ultimately, Antiochus Epiphanes turns his attention to the people of Israel. And what he does is he goes in there, he desecrates the temple, he bribes the Sadducees, but the people of Judea are so outraged that they revolt and kick him out. That summary is everything that we read tonight. So if I just read all of that and said to you, this is what it is, you'd have said, yeah? So you say, now that I've gone through it in a little bit more detail, not like before, the incredible detail I went with chapter 9. Now that I've gone through this particular detail, you're probably sitting there and saying, yeah, is that so? But hopefully I've given you enough information that you can see the progression that I'm talking about. It's essentially an actual historical progression. And the part that's really important with regard to Jewish history is the desecration of the temple by Antiochus Epiphanes, this last bit that I've actually talked to you about. And so that brings us to I might have actually finished it today. We ran a little bit late. So I was hoping to finish the whole chapter, but maybe you've had enough anyway. So that's all, and that's all very good. And Brother Munyanziwa, could you just close us in prayer, please? Anybody we need to pray for? Brother Justice, of course, not well, and Sister Violet's family as well, and Dad.